So welcome to the HKS Energy Policy Seminar. I'm Joe Alding. I'll serve as the host for the seminar today, and we're thrilled to get the spring semester seminar series up and running. We will meet on Mondays at lunchtime for the rest of the semester, except when the university is away on holiday. We are, as we have been this year, operating in a hybrid format. So we want to welcome our friends who are joining us on Zoom. And we're also grateful to have so many of our colleagues and our students and friends here with us in person. We're thrilled to have with us today Dr. Ashlie Burkart for her talk, Cultivating a Greener Future, Regenerative Agricultural Policies. Dr. Burkart is the Chief Scientific Officer at Germinate Ventures and an associate in the Belfer Center's Environment and Natural Resources Program. Ashlie Burkart earned her MD from McGill University's Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences, and she was busy. She completed 2 residencies in anatomic pathology and clinical pathology at the Johns Hopkins Medical Institutions. Dr. Burkart's research explores the intersection of health, ecology, agriculture, and climate change. Ashlie, welcome to the Energy Policy Seminar.
Thank you. So first of all, I just turned the mic on. Can everyone hear me okay? We're good? All right, perfect. Very nice to meet everyone. As Joe mentioned, again, I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of Germinate Ventures. I also serve as an associate here at the Belfer Center in the Environment and Natural Resources Program. I always think it's helpful to know, how do you arrive at the coordinates that you're at? Why am I giving this talk in the first place? And so what I'm going to say is I'm going to explain a little bit about why I connect with food and agriculture on multiple fronts. And this is beyond my fondness for a good meal. So on a professional level, yes, I am a medical doctor. Specifically, my expertise is in gastrointestinal pathology. So I look under the microscope for diagnoses like colon cancer and celiac disease and inflammatory bowel disease. So I say I've been looking at guts and butts for over a decade. On a research and personal level, I actually at one point had to play not only the role of the doctor, but I played the role of the patient. And it really made me have this medical epiphany that our health system wasn't paying enough attention to food, and our food system wasn't paying enough attention to health. And this fueled me having some grant-funded research where I'm looking at how chronic inflammatory diseases are connected to gut health. That is where I got in on the investment level. So I was introduced to my managing partner, and I realized that if you really want to have a big impact on health, when you invest in food and agriculture, it's the best place to do it because you get to impact not only human health, ecological health, soil health, planetary health, you name it. The whole idea of this one health and how we're actually connected to that. And then on a policy level, I think because of this fortunate position of being able to meet founders, experts, and practitioners all over the world, you get an idea of what ambition loops need to be in place, what lassos need to be in place as well. So that's where I came in, and I've been teaching study groups. In fact, I noticed a few faces here from the study group on investment, innovation, and policy in regenerative agriculture. And so what a lot of this is going to be a culmination of what we've learned through talking to these experts and founders and farmers, people in the supply chain, etc. So first of all, I'm going to ask everyone, I'm going to put you on the spot. Have you heard of regenerative agriculture? If so, raise your hand. Well, okay, your Harvards are going to be a little ahead of the curve. What percentage of you who raise your hand understand what that means? All right, fair enough. So if you actually survey people, only 19% of consumers have heard of it and only 4% know what it means. So look at this as an opportunity to put on your thinking cap because you may be able to be part of the solution. So what exactly is regenerative agriculture? If I was going to summarize it in one slide, it's a movement centered around regenerating the soil, all right? So the key focus is building healthy soil. And in doing so, you're dialing back and you're improving rural socioeconomics. You're helping with the environment. Speaking of, you can dial back on our biodiversity, our climate, and our water crises. You're impacting health. We're going to go a little bit into that. And you're impacting animal and worker welfare. However, with all of those benefits, there are challenges. There are challenges to adopting it from the perspective of farmers, the supply chain, and consumers. There are challenges to measurement and verification. So we're going to talk about these challenges and also talk about how those could be seen as opportunities. So what bold government policies could provide those ambition loops and those lassos that are necessary. So before I go on, I think it's really important to mention that this is not a fringe movement. At least there's not evidence of, or it's becoming more and more mainstream, and there's evidence for this because many big companies are supporting regenerative agriculture, and the reason is they need to do it for financial opportunities, but also because it's an opportunity to reduce their scope 3 emissions, meaning their carbon footprint within their supply chain, and to meet their net zero and their ecosystem service commitments. And these are, pretty big names out there. To give an example, Nestle has committed $1.3 billion, and they want 20% of their ingredients to be regeneratively sourced by 2025 and 50% by 2030. That's quite a commitment. PepsiCo has already started getting some data back in the supply chain, and in India, they've found 3% increase in yields, 20% less greenhouse gas emissions. In Thailand, 18% more yields, 36% less water use. But if we look at all of the top 79 companies, and by top I mean their worth, so this is worth the top $3 trillion of our agri-food sector, 50 of the 79 companies have mentioned regenerative agriculture in their disclosures. So this means this is not fringe anymore, but it also means we need to be paying attention, because while it's fantastic to know that it's not a fringe movement and it's scaling, it also means that we need to be careful that we're not greenwashing, because a minority provided qualified targets, a minority provided metrics and data, and a minority are providing financial support to the farmers for this transition. So this is really kind of an exciting opportunity for all of us here. So moving forward, we need well-defined definitions. We need robust data to ensure that this is really impactful and not just, a trend, and to support our farmers and our supply chain to de-risk the transition. All right. I also want to point out, this is not a big ag thing. That was more just to get your attention so that you understand that this is an important trend. If anything, we also need to keep in mind that smallholder farmers, which are farmers by definition that have farms that are less than 2 hectares or 5 acres, they're an invaluable asset to our global economy. And in fact, if you look at this, I just want to clarify, a family farm and a smallholder farm is not the same definition, because family farms is just who owns and operates it. And believe it or not, family farms actually provide 80% of our food production. But smallholder farms, which again are less than 2 hectares, they represent 84% of all farms. They operate on only 12% of agricultural land, and yet they yield 35% of the world's food. So these small farms can yield over 2 times more food per acre. And the point being is we also need to be prioritizing investments into these small and mid-sized farms to reinvigorate rural communities and make local food more widely available. All right. So what kind of attention is it getting on the worldwide front? COP28, which just happened, they just launched the action agenda on regenerative landscapes. The goal is to scale regenerative agriculture. They want to transition 160 million hectares by 2030, and they're engaging 3.6 million farmers worldwide. That's an investment of $2 billion that they're already putting in on top of a $2.2 billion investment. What about funding in the US that's actually supporting regenerative agriculture? Well, if we look at the Inflation Reduction Act, $20 billion has been put towards programs over the next 5 years, and an extra $4 billion for the droughts in the West. And this is the largest climate investment since the 1930s, which was also farm-based, for the Dust Bowl. The reason why is because our national crop insurance is becoming more and more costly to taxpayers. In 2002, it was $3 billion. Just in 2022, $19 billion. And this is because of disaster-related expenses due to droughts, due to flooding, due to extreme heat, etc. So it's supposed to be a cost-productive reduction so that we build more resiliency into our food system. And lastly, the Climate Smart Commodity Act, another $3.1 billion into 141 projects. Many of these are regenerative agriculture and soil-based. Okay, so what is an opportunity that one of you could play in this room, or someone listening online? The Farm Bill of 2023, it's actually been extended through September 24, is the most impactful package of legislation related to agriculture and sets the stage for our food and farm systems. It does anything from the farmer's access to capital, to crop insurance, to food access for low-income families, to supporting sustainable farming and research and funding. So, what kind of incentives do we need to be put into this bill to transition to regenerative agriculture? So the next question you might be asking is, okay, this is great, but why do we need a paradigm shift? Well, first of all, farmers and agricultural workers are struggling more than ever, expecting yet another 16% drop in net farm income in 2023. About 75% witnessed reduced yields due to recent droughts, and farmers are facing increased soil erosion, biodiversity loss, and extreme weather. Input costs are rising, and 20% of our agricultural workers are below national poverty lines. So, okay, let's explain a little bit of background behind the current agricultural system. So after World War II, we started adding synthetic fertilizers, agrochemicals, and heavy machinery. And to be honest with you, it was really effective at first. In the first couple decades, our crop production more than doubled, which is why this whole paradigm shift happened, and they called it the Green Revolution. Oh, I can probably get that. Let me pull that when we get afterwards. So now crop production has plateaued, and this is despite an 800-fold increase in synthetic fertilizer use. So again, you can see that that synthetic fertilizer has increased by 800-fold, but our crop production is plateauing. And I will find those units if I can not do it quick. Crop production, tons per elemental nitrogen contained in synthetic fertilizer. And I can get you the details after. So the one issue is that this single focus on production, which did, again, benefit us early on, it did result in it being the largest contributor to environmental change, including air and water pollution, eutrophication, greenhouse gas emissions. So it's about 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, extensive water use, and it has a very low resiliency. So the idea is that we need to urgently regenerate these resources in order to grow our food better once again. Now, the rising costs of synthetic fertilizers do prompt a paradigm shift opportunity. Let's talk a little bit about soil health. All right, so according to the United Nations, what percentage of soil will be at risk by 2050? Raise your hand if you think it's 20%. If you think it's 50%, raise your hand. If you think it's 75%, okay, and if you think it's 90%. All right, so the answer is 90%. According to the UN, 90% of our soil will be at risk at 2050 if we continue our unsustainable agricultural process. So right now, 30 soccer fields of topsoil are lost to erosion every minute worldwide. And according to a peer-reviewed research in PNAS, the US Corn Belt has already lost 1/3 of its topsoil. This is an existential threat here. Well, what makes healthy soil? Soil organic matter is a big component to healthy soil. And what this means is this is kind of like the soil biota, or maybe you could even think of it as a component of it is a soil microbiome. And are many of you aware of how the microbiome is playing a bigger and bigger part in human health? Okay, so that's becoming more and more, we're learning more and more about that. We're finding out the same thing about soil, which is also why this is a new paradigm. We didn't have the ability to study the soil like we are now and understand how these microbes are contributing. But now we're finding out that they control plant disease, they form symbiotic associations with plant roots, they recycle essential nutrients, they help to detoxify contaminants, they improve the soil structure so that they can hold water and nutrients better, and they ultimately improve crop production. So for every 1% increase in soil organic matter, you're locking away about 10 more tons of carbon per acre and about 20,000 more gallons of water per acre. So soil is a massively mitigated opportunity to address both our climate and water security crises. And according to a UN scientist who modeled this, she believes that if we could get half of farmland to just increase their soil organic matter by 1%, I shouldn't say just, that's still, it would be a lofty thing. This could be equivalent to 31 gigatons of carbon dioxide stored per year, which is 3 times the amount of the transportation sector. So again, why are we looking at soil microbes now? We are having technological advances that didn't exist before. There's frontier sciences in multiomics, in transcriptomics, metatranscriptomics, metabolomics, proteomics, spatial biology, epigenomics, all of these things that are really only in the last 10 years improving, and it's improving at a Moore's Law pace, which is one of the reasons that this is becoming a more robust science. And also we're getting better at measuring it and understanding it. In fact, this was a publication from Nature Reviews that's actually was discussing the whole idea of a One Health connection, how microorganisms are playing a pivotal role, not only in soil health, but plant health, animal health, and human health. So one of the keystone organisms, and I'm going to show these cool videos, these are mycorrhizae fungi. All right, and you can kind of think of them as akin to the coral reefs of the soil. So if you were to destroy the coral reefs, right, this would have a major impact on the ecosystem. So what these do is they mine for phosphorus and other minerals, and then they exchange with the plants carbon that has been made through photosynthesis by trees and plants, etc. And they help move this carbon around and supply nutrients and water. In fact, they're referred to as the wood wide web. So they're supporting biodiversity, they're holding the soil together, they're boosting the ability of plants to fight off attacks. But if you think about it, because here's an image of, again, nutrient flow through these mycorrhizae, and here's an example of these electrically excitable conducts of electricity among the hyphae. If you go in and till the soil, you're going to be damaging these hyphae and these connections, which are vital for protecting the microbes of the soil. And another thing is this also explains why too much synthetic fertilizer can be problematic, because all of a sudden the plant becomes very spoiled. It no longer has to cooperate with the mycorrhizae, for example, to exchange phosphorus. It can be as selfish as it wants, and as a result, the mycorrhizae die back. As they die back, so do other healthy and important microbes of the soil. So let's talk then, what is regenerative agriculture? So it's a hot topic. And the key practices, there's first of all, no one size fits all. Obviously, this would be customized to each farm. But in general, the key practices of regenerative agriculture are to minimize soil disturbance, as I just explained, no tilling, removing or reducing synthetic fertilizers, herbicides, and pesticides, to cover the soil at all times, to provide on-farm biodiversity, to maximize continuous living roots. So, for example, to add in perennials and trees and permanent crops. And if you think about it this way, you're supplying carbon all the time to this community below. Animal integration and compost, I almost think of it as the probiotic for the soil, and other context-driven practices that might be specific to that. Now, this slide took a long time for me to put together and make it as simple as possible, but I'm really happy at how this turned out. Here are the potential benefits of regenerative agriculture. So again, socioeconomics, and we're going to dive in a little deeper on that. Better farm profits, yields, resiliency, and input costs. On the environmental piece, again, we're going to dive into these 6 main aspects that it can improve on the environment. Health, we're talking about more nutrient food and increased food variety, which again, we'll discuss a little bit more. And on the human and animal welfare, it's reduced exposure to agrochemicals and improve well-being for animals. So, socioeconomic benefits. We should look at the farmer's profit as the carrot for adoption. Everything else that I mentioned will just be a byproduct of success of the farmer. If we can't make this work socioeconomically for them, this isn't going to work. So it has to be the primary incentive is farmer's profit. So let's actually dive into this, and let's also put the elephant out in the room. It can take some time to realize the economic benefits of regenerative agriculture. Here's a study by Bain and Company, and that's because by changing practices, if you think about it, it takes time to truly regenerate a resource. So they actually say from 2 to 5 years, a farmer can go through something called a valley of death, where again, after they get to this break-even point, there's evidence that they're making profit per hectare. But something we need to keep in mind in terms of policy and flexible financing. All right, another study by BCG showed that transitioning, and this is looking over, projecting over 10 years, that if you transitioned to regenerative agriculture, the yield would increase by 70% if you did what I would call regenerative agriculture light, meaning you're just adding in, let's say, cover crops and less frequent tilling, etc. But if you go in regenerative agriculture heavy, they're looking at 120% higher profitability. That being said, because of upfront costs, including an initial dive in yield until it's recovered, this looks at an overall return on investment over 10 years of 15 to 25%. And the BCG maps out a revenue bridge, so how you can strategically map out the adoption of the various regenerative practices and how it translates to incremental revenue benefits for farmers. So lastly, some studies that are showing the economic gains. The Ignatius Foundation found 78% more profitability in regeneratively sourced corn. But what's interesting about this study is they also found that the pests were 10 times lower in regenerative agriculture compared to conventional that were insecticide treated cornfields, showing that how the power of soil health for helping with host defense. The Soil Health Institute looked at 100 farms and found that 85% of corn, 88% of soybean showed net income increases. 97% had improved crop resilience to drought and heavy rainfall. 67% achieved higher yields than conventional systems. The key takeaway is, yes, there's evidence for profitability, resilience, less water use, and decreased pests, but the economic benefits may take some time. So a key part of this is the flexible financing is needed. That might be deferring loans early on as you're moving to soil management, and anything that would front load the farmers with capital for this transition. More data and more technical resources are needed so that, especially regionally, we can actually help through this transition and mitigate any of the difficulties through it. And lastly, reduced input costs can soften the shift. All right, the environmental benefits. So we've already discussed these top two, which is topsoil and helping with things like disease and pest control. I quickly mentioned about water, so I'm just going to say it once again. Every 1% increase in soil organic matter, you're locking away about 20,000 more gallons of water per acre. And there was even a peer-reviewed study that was actually done in Nigeria, but they were talking about something called healthy soil can actually prevent something called a flood drought paradox, meaning that if you're having a lot of runoff, it's resulting in flooding, but then that runoff, because that water is not staying in the soil, you're also paradoxically resulting in drought. And we've seen it in other countries, Pakistan, etc. Supports biodiversity, ecosystems, pollinators, reduce nitrogen, phosphorus pollution, pesticide and herbicide toxicity. And then the last one is carbon sequestration. So since that's a more complicated topic, let's dive a little bit deeper into the carbon sequestration and the climate resilience. So regenerative agriculture is sometimes referred to as carbon farming. And the reason is the soils hold more carbon than the atmosphere and the biotic pool combined. I've already mentioned that if we could get half of farmers to increase their soil organic matter by 1%, this would be about 31 gigatons of carbon per year per a UN scientist. The counter arguments, there are measurement challenges. It's expensive to measure carbon. Carbon roughly correlates to soil organic matter, which is the whole reason that I gave that entire opening explaining what soil organic matter is. There are capacity limitations. There's only so much you can build, and then you're going to reach your capacity. It's a biologically dynamic process. And lastly, some people argue, why are we focused on carbon? We should just be focusing on land stewardship in general. And I think all these arguments are real. That being said, the carbon markets are robust. They're only going to improve. We might as well learn more about this. So voluntary carbon offsets, about 95% of our offsets are based on emitting less carbon, and about 5% of our offsets are on carbon removal. And we could talk about industrial ways to have carbon removal, such direct air capture, but we're going to be focusing on a nature base and specifically building soil. All right, so there's a lot of demand for these projects that involve building soil. The problem is there's not enough supply. So AKA, we don't have enough farmers engaging. 98% of farmers know about these projects and only 3% engage. And there's reasons why. So first of all, the carbon price is probably too low to still incentivize farmers. I've heard that we need around $100 to kind of get their attention. We need cheaper, scalable, more standardized soil carbon data collection. That's coming out. Right now, we still do a lot of modeling. They say that satellite is only maybe 40 to 60% accurate. There are improvements such as infrared and gamma, which we're getting to 60 to 80% accurate. And then supposedly there's on the forefront some electrochemical that might get to higher than 90% accurate. So with Moore's law, we will see improvements in this. Another issue is long-term commitments are required. So farmers often need 10-year contracts. And you could argue because soil organic matter is biologically dynamic, it's not going to always be permanent. This is where there are solutions out there where people are creating soil inorganic markets, one of which I have to disclose is in our portfolio, Andizag, and their ideas, they're using a biologic that would fix carbon in a mineralized form. This mineralized form can sink for thousands of years. And then lastly, additionality. It's necessary for those that are, so you do need additionality, but that means if you're doing good practices and you're measurably capturing carbon, you may not be able to get, or you won't be able to get rewarded because it's not additional. There are ways around that. So other forms of environmental finance are becoming kind of, are out there when it comes to carbon farming. One is carbon insetting, which are actions taken by an organization within its own value chain. And another is the carbon intensity score. So this is measuring your carbon footprint per bushel. And so the carbon credit is not separate, but rather built into the value of the grain itself. So no additionality or long-term contracts are required. The driving force behind this is a tax credit called the 45Z, which is creating low carbon renewable biofuels. Many people believe that this might ignite similar programs in grain and livestock. I'm by no means an expert in this, but from talking to someone at Regenerative, or who does regenerative agriculture, called Continuum Ag, they say that the average CI score for, let's say, corn is 29, has a carbon intensity score of 29. But if you can get farmers to adopt these practices, they're boasting that their average customer has a carbon intensity score of 9, which means that they get a higher price per bushel because of this carbon intensity score. Other things to be talking about are ecosystem services, biodiversity, and water markets. All right, so as if we haven't covered enough already. All right, the potential health benefits of regenerative agriculture. I would break it into 3 things: food quality, food variety, and food availability. So who here has heard of the term nutrient collapse? All right, to be honest with you, this is a new concept for me. I only learned about in the last couple of years. But the nutrient density of our food has declined up to 38% over the last 50 years in fruits and vegetables. This is leading to a hidden hunger epidemic where about 2 billion people worldwide, even though they have sufficient caloric intake, they have a lack of micronutrients and essential minerals. And the idea is they're thinking that soil health is playing a big role in this nutrient collapse. We definitely need much more data, but some of the emerging studies out there, this is one study that showed that higher soil organic matter correlated with higher nutrient density. And in produce, it was 11 to 34% higher nutrient composition, and in beef and pork, 3 to 11 times higher fatty acids and bioactives. Again, we need more data needed. There are companies out there that are helping with this data layer. Audacious is trying to find ways to measure nutrient density more effectively. a company in our portfolio, Brightseed, is trying to discover more bioactives so that we better understand this connection of nutrient density and health. All right, food variety. What percentage of the world's food is generated from 3 crops? Raise your hand if you think it's 20%, if you think it's 40%, 50%, 60%. All right, yep, this is shocking. 60% of our food is generated from just 3 crops. That's sugar, maize, rice, and then it's closely followed by wheat. And if we look at 75% of our world's food, it's generated from only 12 crops and 5 animals. Talking about resiliency in a food system, and especially as we're coming across extreme weather and all these things, this is something to be concerned about. Plus, from the health perspective, we know that biodiversity in a diet is really important for human health. There are over 300,000 plants that we could be eating. Regenerative agriculture, I would hope, would contribute to increasing food variety, as polyculture and biodiversity is part of regenerative. All right, next question. What's the beef with beef? All right, livestock has been painted pretty negatively as a greenhouse gas emitter, and that's because it contributes to 14% of our greenhouse gas emissions. But the problem may not be necessarily the animal, but how the livestock is raised. Can we have low carbon beef? I'm going to show you a really extreme example that's probably not doable on a majority of ranches, but this is a case where a study by Stanley et al. Looked at something called mob grazing, where you're actually taking the cattle, concentrating them so that they heavily graze in one area, and then you're letting that area rest so that the soil can regenerate, and then you can have grassland restoration. It's supposed to recapitulate natural ruminants like bison. So this is that versus feedlot. Now, I will say that these grass-fed beef did emit more methane because they have a more fibrous diet. However, because they were simultaneously building soil, in this study, it ended up being a net carbon sink. That being said, this degree of sinking is likely not representative of what could happen on vast majority of ranches. Some speculate maybe 2% or so, but it does demonstrate the potential for achieving lower carbon beef and dairy. And so if we look at a meta-analysis, one meta-analysis looked at the 12 different options that we have to help carbon sequestration strategies in livestock. And the top 2 were, as I already mentioned, the rotational grazing, but also something called integrative field management, where you're including trees and seeding and compost and et cetera onto these fields. And this actually ended up reducing, on average, per unit of beef by 62% and per unit of land by 112%. Now, I have to say that if you look at the study very closely, there's a lot of regional variability where some can achieve net zero, some have very little chance to have a big impact on carbon at all. It looked like Brazil and the US were the ones that had the biggest potential for having impact, but even if you look at within the United States, there's a lot of variability. All right, but even if you're not able to have lower carbon beef, there's a lot of holistic benefits to this, such as grassland restoration, enhanced resilience, biodiversity, water preservation, improved animal health, and nutritional quality. So as a result, some industries and some companies are paying farmers for less carbon intensive dairy and beef, such as Organic Valley and Nestle. Considerations to take into account: if you look at a lot of these studies, it may require more land, it's potentially more labor intensive, and we do need additional data for comprehensive analysis. Companies like AgriWebb in our portfolio, but we need to understand how this really affects areas region by region. Okay, challenges for adoption. So I feel like we've covered a lot of benefits, right, for regenerative agriculture. All right, let's get to the hard part. Why are there challenges for people to adopt this? And I broke it into 4 groups to try to make this as concise as possible. And even within this is very nuanced. First of all, financial. We've already dug into this, so I'm not going to keep on beating this up, but essentially we have to have something that protects people against this valley of death and the cost to changing. Cultural, technical, educational, course habit loops. It's hard when the average age of a farmer is about 59 years old to change your habits, and that can be a challenge. Plus, there's limited technical and educational support, especially in certain regions, so we definitely need improvement there. Supply chain, there's underdeveloped markets and low consumer awareness. These are issues. And then also, there are aspects of existing programs that may disencourage regenerative practices. But I look at this as an opportunity. So when you know what the challenges are, then you can come in and you can look at it as an opportunity from a policy perspective, from an investment perspective, and from an innovation perspective. So some policies that could help promote regenerative agriculture is more flexible finance. So front loading these farmers with the capital they need to transition, improving crop insurance rates for those who practice soil health. There's an act out there called the Defer Act, where 50% of the annual payments for your FSA loan would be deferred if you're engaging in soil health management practices. Greater support for small, starting, and first generation farmers. And then, again, as we've already discussed, improving these issues within our environmental finance. Next, cultural, technical, educational. We need access to tailored technical support, and this is happening both in the private sector and the public sector. The USDA needs more educational resources on soil health practices, designing programs to support farmers through this transition, more research on soil health, the soil microbiome, nutrient density, soil contaminants, and then how do we improve our policy narrative to emphasize the benefits to farmers. Regarding the supply chain, connecting farmers with the right markets, verification and transparency, so even verification as a service, this is going to become more and more important. And then also you have obstacles such as a lot of farmers don't want to share their data. So how are we going to maybe have this through a third party that can kind of mitigate being able to verify it and audit it without kind of diving into someone's personal data. Anyways, create market demands for regenerative agriculture through labeling, certification, and customer education campaigns. And I'm going to talk a little bit about labels in a second. And then how do we align our federal farm subsidy programs with regenerative goals? So I'm not going to read all over this because I think this is just too much to go over in this talk, but a good resource is LandCorp. They actually have something called a bill tracker, and they go through all the bills that are helping soil health at this time. So if you're interested in this, I recommend to check their website out. We've already talked about the Defer Act. There's other acts like Cover Crop Flexibility Act and other soil health acts. I'm not going to go through and read all of these, but just so you know, it's there as a resource. And lastly, labels and definitions, they matter. And why do they matter? So first of all, we do not want to stifle any innovation that could happen on a farm or a ranch. So we have to be very careful to not create labels or definitions that would impact that. That being said, it's very confusing as a consumer. How many of you have seen any of these labels in a grocery store? Okay, there's a few people. I've seen them too, but even when I go in there, I'm like, okay, which one's organic, which one's not, which one's based on outcome, which one's based on, procedure, which one, it can get very confusing from a consumer's perspective, but all of these are labels for regenerative agriculture. So then that brings up, do we need a demonstration project in, let's say, the Farm Bill that just says, we're not creating label, but maybe we put resources into figuring out who are the stakeholders and what does this mean and why do labels matter? Well, one, you can have more consumer and supply chain transparency and awareness, and consumers can then pull demand for these sustainably sourced foods and better nutrition in their food. It can support price premiums. It can prevent greenwashing. And then lastly, it can enable better research because we have a definition. So with that in mind, just to summarize everything that we've covered, because I know we've covered a lot, is key benefits in regenerative agriculture. I'd break it into these four: the socioeconomic benefits, the environmental benefits, the health benefits, and the animal and worker welfare benefits. When we think of policy, investment, and innovation opportunities, then let's look at it as there are those four challenges. And out of those four challenges, this is where if we had more flexible finance and better environmental finance, this could really help with the transition, better technical and educational support. And I look at this as even companies that are helping with software as a service or precision agriculture or certain biologics or whatever it is that can help with that transition. The supply chain and the consumer, what do we do to improve that, and aligning our US policies with regenerative agriculture. So I look at it as, what ambition loops need to be in place to help farmers, the supply chain, the private sector, academia, public sector to have these ambition loops so that there's more widely adopted regenerative agriculture. So with that in mind, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of your busy schedules today to come here. Definitely want to thank the Environment and Natural Resources Program here at the Belfer Center, and thank you, Henry Lee, for having me be part of being here. Liz, for always being able to bounce off ideas. Paul Sherman, thank you. Also, thank you to the Center for Business and Government, the Center on the Environment, the Center for Climate and Sustainability. Want to thank Michael Lavin and Charles Home and our Germinate Ventures team. I also want to thank any consultant experts and practitioners and farmers out there who have contributed. For example, I first did here at the Belfer Center a conference which involved multiple practitioners and experts from all over the world. And then a study group that included anyone from the administrator of the FSA to a seventh generation farmer, to experts in environmental finance, to an expert in livestock sustainability, to experts in soil health policy, and then also all the students who were involved in these four study groups. Lastly, we did write up a policy report that is completed, but a little bit in purgatory as to what the next steps are, and included other Harvard faculty, as well as a couple of students. For example, Tao Huang, she actually had experience in the USDA, so she helped to nerd translate some of these ideas as to where it would actually go title-wise in the Farm Bill, Kipper, et cetera, and many people who were reviewers and consulted experts. So yeah, there's a lot of people to thank here. Appreciate you taking the time, and should anyone have any questions, feel free to fire them off.
Thank you, Ashlie. I'll start with the first question and start with a reflection. My first job after I got my master's degree, I went to USDA, and I worked on sustainable agriculture. So we were doing work trying to understand several new programs like Environmental Quality Incentives Program, EQIP. We were looking at changes to the Conservation Reserve Program to include an Environmental Benefits Index. This was part of the ongoing debate about should we have an organic label. So some of this seems similar to this sort of earlier debate about sustainable agriculture. And one thing that I recall from then that I was thinking about as you were presenting, what looked like some of the benefits, the array of benefits and the returns, is that there is this potential on average to see a lot of benefits, but in practice, we see a lot of heterogeneity. And at least that's part of the rationale for why something on average might look beneficial, but you still might want to have subsidies, or you might still want to have, in the context of your discussion, carbon offsets, generating credits from some of these activities. So how do we produce the evidence to understand how well we target, whether it's subsidies from USDA or through the tax code, or whether it's how we evaluate activities in the carbon markets? How are we going to produce the evidence to understand where we're getting sort of this incremental change that matters, and how we get sort of the biggest benefits? If it looks like maybe on average there's a lot of benefits, but we're not seeing as much take up. I was just trying to understand how to sort of make sense of this, and how we're going to produce the evidence so we know we're really getting all these kinds of benefits if we push on regenerative agriculture going forward.
Right, and everyone can still hear me okay, right? I think you've hit it right on the nail. In fact, I feel like that's kind of almost the summary of the talk. Yes, we do have a lot of benefits. How do you make sure that this is truly making impact and not just a trend? That's not an easy answer, but I will say, with Moore's law, our ability to collect data and look at larger, data lakes is improving. And I think it's really going to be cooperation between the private sector, the academic sector, the public sector all together, because, in all honesty, these big companies, they need this data too. Because the last thing that one of these big companies want to do is make all of these claims, and then all of a sudden it gets audited if they have no way to support it. So there are companies out there that their whole premise, and this is private, public, is actually keeping this data layer. Some of them, for example, there's one called CLIM in Europe, where it's actually helping to connect these companies to their farmers, and then they're kind of pooling the data. So it's not an individual, but like as a pooled data, you can see what's going on. I think that will be the new driving force, the fact that there's all of these net zero commitments that people have to meet, and these ecosystem service commitments that are going to meet. It's really kind of, how do I say, driving this verification as a service and this data to be more and more important. Yeah.
Okay.
But I do agree there's also a lot of variability, and that's where, we're just also going to just have to be able to fine tune things region by region and be very careful about a blanket one size fits all, because there isn't.
Yeah. Right. Let me open it up to the audience.
What about so there'd be a big coalition in agriculture of companies that don't want this to happen, like fertilizer producers and seed producers, and it's a pretty concentrated middleman. So how do we get them on board?
You would think that they don't want to be on board, but actually you're seeing, for example, Bayer kind of surprised me when I saw that they actually are signing up for regenerative agriculture. Again, we have to just make sure that this is actually truly not greenwashing and other aspects. But I think they look at it as this is a decisive decade, and we're kind of facing some existential threats that if they don't kind of come up with new and innovative ways to do this, that they just won't have a market. I mean, the question is yeah, I think so. I wouldn't say that this is necessarily at odds with these companies. That being said, we just have to make sure that it's just not greenwashing. Yeah. Thank you.
So hi, I'm an Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellow, and there are some fellow fellows with me here, and we're very dedicated to this topic. I'm also on the board of the World Living Soils Forum, etc. And first of all, thank you so much for what you're doing. It's so essential. I've never seen anyone present so much in one place. That's incredible. So my question is going to be about your observations of how to bring consumers on board. So my husband and I own a winery in France, which for the last 30 years has been a pioneer in regenerative viticulture, doing groundbreaking work, no pun intended. Mm-hmm. And our work with carbon has led us to a shift in our focus to biodiversity, carbon being the consequence, but not the origin of the situation. So we're seeing that as a leading indicator of soil health. But it's even more difficult to quantify, and we're starting to see some green tech in that space, et cetera. But one of the things that we've noticed in communicating with consumers is that we have 8 certifications. Consumers seem to have certification fatigue, cynicism, confusion. Mm-hmm. And ironically, of all of the ones we have, some of which are extremely demanding to obtain, the only one that consumers seem to be able to connect with and latch onto is our bee-friendly certification. We have a program called Sustainability, which is one of many things we do, and yet the bee has already been rebranded as this kind of superhero that is the symbol for the whole environment. It's very easy to get that certification as long as you don't use chemicals, and yet do we think that for a consumer, it's helpful if we could all band together around something that a consumer can actually already relate to?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Complex question. And to be honest with you, I was hoping initially it would be consumers who would be driving, this movement. And unfortunately, we have found that they're not at this point willing to pay the extra price premium for this. So in the future, perhaps there will be a data layer where you can literally give a score to, let's say, a nutrient density of a food, where you can go in and be like, I'm going to buy the apple with X amount versus this amount. So maybe that will eventually drive prices. But I do think at this moment, the best bet is really kind of working within supply chains and just these companies that have to meet these obligations, and just know that through doing that, they are dialing away at this. And as more people understand the nuances and understand what this means, I'm hoping that consumer adoption would follow suit. But yeah, right now it doesn't seem like they're willing to pay the extra money for this. Yeah.
Great, thank you for your talk. I'm Charles Taylor. I'm an environmental economist here at the Kennedy School. This is kind of a high level question that's not going to be an easy question to answer, but we've been trying to increase the adoption of these types of practices for at least the last decade or two through USDA policies, through like private, kind of consumer based outreach, and it's been really hard. But like one program where we've been really successful has been kind of the Conservation Reserve Program, where just like every year we have tens of millions of acres enrolled in conservation, doing all of these practices, taking land out of agricultural, marginal lands out of agriculture, but like getting all these environmental benefits that you've been talking about. Is there kind of like a trade-off here between kind of what we'd call like in economics the intensive and extensive margin of just like, if we can achieve a lot of our carbon goals and environmental goals and biodiversity goals by like kind of reducing production on marginal lands, and then kind of let there be intensive lands where kind of where things are happening existing, rather than kind of try this ground up dissemination of these practices more broadly? Is that a dimension we should be thinking about?
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, that's a pretty loaded question. So you're right. This will be hard to answer. Thank you for proposing that. I'm kidding. To be honest with you, I think it's right time, right place. And anything, if you think about adoption of anything, always takes kind of an exponential, very slow, it seems at first, and then slowly it gets momentum. The momentum at this point may not even be in, for example, in the US, but you're seeing more carrots and more sticks, especially in the EU. And as I feel like that's a big one that's driving a lot of Nestle's practices, et cetera, and a lot of these European countries. So, as they are required to engage in a lot of these net zero and other kind of aspects, that will be kind of a big driving force. But I agree, the adoption is going to appear slow at first, but then again, hopefully more and more momentum. But I think the biggest thing will be the sticks and carrots that we see out there, especially for a lot of these large companies.
Hello. Thank you so much for the presentation. So my name is Kailash. I'm from Nepal, and I'm an MPID candidate here. So actually this winter, I was in Nepal kind of promoting these regenerative agriculture practices, looking at fields where they did RCTs for biochar and all those things. And when I've been working in this field, one big challenge was it is kind of at odds with socioeconomic sort of, poverty alleviation in the context of the global south, because in the past 10 years, 15 years, they've heavily promoted sort of yield maximization. And then now there could be in this switching transition term, even if there is a long term, farmers are present biased. So in this switching transition term, there could be 1 to 2 years, but there could be yield loss or not as much as yield as they are historically seeing. And for these farmers, every year of reduced sort of income leads to big changes in the investments they make in their kids, right, across gender and other challenges that may pose. So what are some market mechanisms or some incentives that are keeping in place to help in this particular switching costs?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, if you think about it, farmers are already struggling already. They're going to be a little bit more risk adverse to take on a potentially, let's say, another little dive in yields, even if it's only for a couple of years and it changes things. Let's see here. In terms of, there's a couple pieces here. So this is where I would hope things like, again, new enterprise models can really help in terms of helping the farmer. In terms of the global south, you mentioned JBS, for example, is putting, don't quote me on the amount, but I want to say 100 million into research and looking at how this can affect ranchers in Brazil mainly. We're seeing kind of more money being put into this, but you're right, there is a potential for upfront 60% yield loss in some cases. But keep in mind, some people, when I talk to experts, they're recommending just put 10% of your field and start out and kind of learn best practices, and then slowly you can kind of increase the amount so that you're mitigating your risk. But the question is, if they don't change these practices, what will happen in 10 years when we're facing more extreme heat and flooding and drought? It's going to be those that are waiting longer and longer that are going to even be facing more and more problems in those next 10 years, if that makes sense. So again, this is where I'm hoping that we can just find whatever can help with that transition and the financing behind it. Yep.
Thank you, Ashlie. That was incredibly informative in such a short period of time. I am a graduate student at the Harvard Extension School, and I'm currently doing my thesis on whether or not agrivoltaics can help with the transition to regenerative farming by like an economic incentive. But I'm also in the second year currently in the Valley of Death, building a small regenerative farm in California. And where I live, and I just came from the Eco Farm Conference, which is one of the biggest and longest standing organic farmer conferences in the country. And this is more anecdotal for you. I think that green washing is already happening. There were many organic farmers that were very, very upset because they have clients who are like, well, we don't want to buy your produce anymore because it's not regenerative. And they're like, hey, organic by definition is regenerative. So the same practices of like low or minimal till and, no inputs and things like that, and prioritizing soil health is organic. So for all of us, when we're like thinking about labels and verification, organic regenerative may be the terminology, and we have to watch those large F&B companies that are saying we're regenerative. They may only be saying, okay, we're not going to till, but we're still adding a lot of inputs. So thanks and good luck to you.
Sure. Let me just try to answer that the best I can. And this is nuanced. And again, I feel like we're trying to answer very big problems in very short sound bites. But one thing I will say is, you're right. There are many amazing things about organic farming, and I am a proponent of that. But we are seeing that not all not all organic actually are regenerating the soil. And if you even just look at nutrient density, they show that conventional has like nutrient density of about this much, where organic, there's a huge variation. And so they're finding that some practices in organic, especially organic regenerative, are really, really beneficial to the land, to the health, to reducing agrochemicals. But there are still some organic practices that can inadvertently damage soil. So we actually do need more evidence to kind of figure out which is which. But yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. I feel like we can't change everything. But if we can be dialing back on even getting people to reduce agrochemicals and synthetic fertilizers, that is a big step one. It just, it kind of depends how you want to go about that. But yes, there's a lot, and I agree with the greenwashing. This is why I think labels and definitions do matter, but balancing it with not affecting innovation on the farm. This is where I think we need many more stakeholders involved, and we need more discussions on how to address that.
Thank you, Ashlie. I'm David. I'm a joint degree MPP here, and I'm at Sloan this year for an MBA. I wanted to ask you about greenhouses and what role you think, if any, they play. I'm very curious about what your take is for two reasons. One, that statistic about the soil that is at risk was just staggering, and I'm curious what you think about their ability to provide a shield from elements. And then I'm also wondering, just from an economic perspective, because I think you'd mentioned that 88%, like there's just, you need the financial incentive to be there for the farmer, and there's proof that in the majority of cases they are boosting profits. So pretty open-ended question, but just what do you think about greenhouses, and do they play a role?
And I may not be the best person to answer this, because when I think of greenhouses, I usually don't think of them as something that's building or regenerating soil. So I don't know if they necessarily are part of regenerative agriculture per se, but definitely as we are facing all sorts of existential threats, you know, this is one way that we're going to be dialing back. I don't think that there's always just one way to address, you know, our food system moving forward. That's probably just something I just, you know, have less expertise in how it actually plays a role in regenerative agriculture. Yeah.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm Rebecca. I'm an MPP1 here at the Kennedy School. I'm curious, given all of the financial and environmental benefits, I think one of the biggest challenges in the regenerative agriculture adoption has been a little bit on the cultural side. So I've done some work helping to start some regenerative agriculture pilots. And one of the things that I've heard just talking to the farmers is, my dad did it this way, and so why would I do it another way? I'm curious, how do you think about policy influencing and helping kind of the educational component for that transition when there is just a set way of doing it without kind of having a top-down approach that still keeps the farmer-centric approach that's so central to having kind of robust regenerative agriculture?
Yep, I think you're right. Habit loops are important, and once people have a certain belief system, it's really can be hard to change that. I think, actually, to be honest with you, if the movement's going to have any progress, it's through farmers themselves, not through anyone else kind of telling anyone what to do. It's more that, you know, you're talking to so-and-so down the road, and they've shown that they've had this kind of progress and this has worked well for them, and word of mouth, and it's kind of like local community, and you know, who's sitting down and having coffee with each other. So a lot of this is also, if you're interested in this movement, you know, go down and talk to farmers. You know, so many of us just sit in these kind of rooms and then become echo chambers. Like we went down to Oklahoma and spent time on a ranch and a farm and a grain elevator, and you know, see what's happening in their discourse. I think that's actually going to be a really important part of disseminating that information.
I think I'm next. So first, I agree with that 100%. In my previous life, we funded some tech to farm activities. One, it's called Alice. It's in Ontario. They're trying to do exactly what you're talking about, farmer to farmer, regen to others. And I think that is the key to some of these practice adoption. Two questions. Could you tell me more about, or ask more about the nutrient decline or collapse ecosystem and this research startup? Where is it at? And then the other is, you know, you touched on the 12 crops and 5 animals, you know, so what's there as well? What's the research or ecosystem of entrepreneurs that are working on that problem in terms of trying to get more biodiverse crops and animals?
Okay, sure. I'll just try to mention names that I've seen. Again, a lot of these I have not dug into, you know, a lot about the companies, but there are a lot of startups that are trying to kind of address this. Again, first of all, the nutrient collapse that came from a peer-reviewed study around 2002 that was looking at the last 50 years of food. I will just say, in terms of the data around our nutrient quality, it's pretty meek. And if you actually look at the USDA website and try to figure out, let's say, what the average nutrients are of a strawberry, it may be based on 6 samples that were pulled from the same grocery store in the same location. You know, so we're not really capturing a lot of on nutrients. So I feel like that's kind of actually a big unknown, and we're only going to learn more and more. Again, one of the companies, you know, I have no financial or any relationship with them, but Audacious is trying to figure out ways to be able to have a bigger data layer so that we can understand what farming practices drive higher nutrient value. In terms of biodiversity, it's tough because, you know, you want something that's going to be able to insert itself into what our existing food system is. which you could argue for better or worse, things like that. I can think of a company, again, I have no connections to them, but it's Tiara Foods, where they are trying to source different trees that are found to be very carbon intensive. They're also indigenous to certain cultures. Their main focus right now is in Central America, and that these are more nutrient rich food that can be kind of inserted in place of, let's say, wheat or other things within the supply chain, and they are working to like help some of these companies add more diversity into their food. But I think biodiversity, to be honest with you, is one of the things that's on our thesis for Germinate, and we would really like to figure out, what are better ways to be able to measure it, what are better ways to be able to incorporate biodiversity into our food system, especially with all the parameters that already exist. So yeah, hopefully that was helpful.
Hi, I'm Jackie. I'm a mid-career and Master in Public Administration student here at the Kennedy School. I have two questions very quickly. One is whether, I know in New Zealand, in the past, historically, they've had agricultural extension officers going to farms and helping farmers. I wondered at what degree that happens here in the States, either at the federal or state level. And the second question is, I've noticed shopping for organic vegetables here. I don't see a lot of difference between those that are labelled organic and those that are not, whereas where I come from in the Cook Islands in the South Pacific, tomatoes that are organic are more flavoursome and deeper in colour, and the carrots are skinnier, and green leafy vegetables are attacked by the caterpillars. So that the ones with the holes in them are you can tell they're definitely organic because there's no pesticides used on those. So I just noticed there's not much of a difference. So I just wondered if you know anything about.
Maybe, so I might have to have you repeat the first question, but the second question is, it might be because we don't have enough emphasis on local foods. And again, this kind of gets back to that whole story I was telling with these smallholder farms, like really kind of better, backing them has multiple benefits. Not only are they more productive with food, but also it allows that food to stay more local. And I feel like a lot of times it's because we're seeing things that, even though it's organic, it's come from halfway across the world, et cetera. And so maybe that's an answer. I'm not sure if I'm necessarily answering it. Could you ask your first question?
Agricultural extension officers that come in and help farmers.
Oh,
yeah. Do you have any schemes like that here in the States?
Yeah, I mean, I can, again, companies I don't have any connections with, but for example, Continuum Ag is one of those that's helping, and CLIM is another one that's helping farmers transition and kind of selecting, what are the best ways to do this and what are the ways to be measuring it, et cetera. So there are companies out there that are trying to help with that transition, but also I feel like we need that from the public sector as well as the private sector. So, and also you can even just think of precision ag companies like Fielden in our portfolio, et cetera, that are helping to drive these practices through more digital software and kind of things like that. Yep.
Jackie, a quick comment on your question. I don't think it's true today, but it used to be that there was one federal agency that had a representative in every county in America, and that was the Department of Agriculture through the Extension Service. So there has been a sort of a long history of extension ag agents from the Department of Agriculture working, and there's been a number of regional research stations that work with the extension agents, that work with the farmers, and there's a bit of sort of a history of sort of the back and forth that dates back to sort of like, some of this going back to like when we started to really see improvements in hybrid corn in the 30s and 40s and where that went throughout the country. And so the question is whether or not there's more effort on regenerative agriculture or generation before sustainable agriculture going through the ag extension agents. I don't know the answer to that, but there is that kind of apparatus that could be used through the government. Before we wrap up, let me note that we will meet again at noon on Monday of next week Abby Ostreicher, who's a Harvard Environmental Fellow, will be here for her presentation. And finally, please join me in thanking Ashlie Burkart for her presentation. Thank you, Ashlie.